Faro, North Carolina. A soybean field, flat and quiet, less than an hour from the Atlantic coast. If you drive out on Big Daddy's Road today, past the water tower and the tobacco barns, you can find it. A small granite marker on the shoulder is the only thing that tells you anything happened here at all. 180 feet below the topsoil sits the uranium core of a 4-megaton hydrogen bomb. The United States government owns a permanent easement over the ground where it lies. No one has ever dug it out. Every planting season, tractors pass over it. How did it get there? And why is it still there? This is the story of the night the United States almost nuked itself. And of the second night, 19 years later, when it almost happened again. Is the story of one fuel leak, one falling airplane, one arming switch, one drop socket, and the thin margin between an ordinary American Wednesday and the largest man-made disaster in modern history. It begins on the morning of January 24, 1961. John F. Kennedy has been President of the United States for just 4 days. He has not yet delivered a State of the Union. He has not yet met a foreign head of state. And somewhere over the Great Plains, over the coast of Georgia, over the North Atlantic, dozens of American bombers are already in the air, fully loaded with thermonuclear weapons, waiting for a war that could begin at any second. The United States and the Soviet Union are locked in the coldest phase of the Cold War. Both sides have hydrogen bombs. Both sides are convinced the other side is one order away from using them. And the American military's answer to that fear has a name. It is called Operation Chrome Dome. The doctrine is simple and slightly insane. To make sure the Soviets can never destroy the American nuclear response in a first strike on the ground, the Strategic Air Command keeps a fleet of nuclear-armed B-52s permanently in the air. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, rotating shifts, loaded weapons, for years on end. The program will run, in some form, from 1960 until 1968. Almost a decade of live nuclear bombs circling the planet on autopilot. According to documents progressively declassified between the 1990s and 2021, and to independent reporting compiled by investigative journalist Eric Schlosser, in his book Command and Control, the number of times something went wrong on these missions is not a handful. It is in the hundreds. Each incident got its own Pentagon file and its own Pentagon codename. The codename was Broken Arrow. That morning, a B-52 nicknamed Keep 19 taxis onto the runway at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in Goldsboro, North Carolina. In command is Major Walter Scott Tulloch, an experienced Strategic Air Command pilot. Alongside him are 7 crew members, all of them trained to sit for 24 straight hours in a cockpit above an armed thermonuclear payload and behave as if it were a normal day at work. Bolted inside the bomb bay are 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs. Each of those bombs is roughly 12 feet long, weighs over 6,000 pounds, and carries a yield of 4 megatons. For million tons of TNT, roughly 260 times more powerful than the bomb that flattened Hiroshima. One of them alone, detonating at low altitude over the eastern seaboard, could deposit lethal fallout, according to a joint estimate published by The Guardian and the Arms Control Association over Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, and as far north as New York City. Millions of people, one weapon. Within a few hours, one of those 2 bombs will hit an American field with its arming sequence complete, its detonation circuit closed, and its final safety catch balanced on a single mechanical fluke. If you want to understand how close the United States came to nuclear detonating a piece of its own territory, and how it managed to do it twice, stay here. To understand what happened above North Carolina that night, you first have to understand what Keep 19 was doing up there in the first place. It was not on a training exercise. It was not carrying inert dummy weapons. It was on a live nuclear patrol. Under Operation Chrome Dome, the Strategic Air Command kept, on average, roughly 12 B-52s in the air over the continental United States and its northern approaches at any given moment. Each aircraft carried between 2 and 4 thermonuclear weapons. Each mission lasted around 24 hours. When one bomber landed, another one took off within minutes to replace it. The rotation never broke. The routes were carved into the sky like invisible highways. One loop ran north over Canada, up along the edge of Soviet airspace, and back. Another tracked south along the Atlantic seaboard. A third traced the border with Mexico. The B-52s flew in radio silence, refueled midair, and were briefed on their war targets before takeoff. If the phone call came from headquarters, they were expected to turn, cross the North Pole, and drop. On any given day of the early 1960s, according to figures later compiled from declassified Pentagon records, more than 100 American nuclear weapons were airborne over the northern hemisphere at all times. In hindsight, the number is almost impossible to sit with. Keep 19 was flying the Eastern Loop. It had taken off from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base the previous day. By the small hours of January 24th, it had already spent close to a full day in the air. Around midnight, it approached its final scheduled refueling. A KC-135 tanker slid into position ahead of it, extended a rigid boom the length of a telephone pole, and began pumping jet fuel into Keep 19's wing tanks. That is when the tanker crew noticed the leak. Fuel was spilling out of Keep 19's right wing. Not dripping, streaming. The tanker pilot broke off the refueling and radioed the news across. At first, it was manageable. The B-52 had spare fuel in the bomb bay. There was a base within reach. Major Tulloch was told to continue circling, dump the excess to lighten the aircraft, and prepare to land at Seymour Johnson at first light. Then the leak got worse. Over the course of 3 minutes, roughly 37,000 pounds of jet fuel poured out of the right wing into the North Carolina night. That is close to the entire fuel load of a fully tanked commercial airliner, gone in the time it takes to read a headline. The aircraft's balance began to change. The right wing grew lighter than the left. The controls began to fight back. The B-52 had been designed to be forgiving. It could survive engine loss. It could survive combat damage. What had not been designed to survive was the sudden, uneven loss of a large fraction of its structural fuel and the aerodynamic imbalance that came with it. At around 12,000 feet, still short of the runway, the aircraft became uncontrollable. It began to yaw and roll, hard, in a direction the pilots could no longer counter. The right wing, undermined and shaking, began to break apart. Major Tulloch keyed the intercom and gave the only order left to give. Bail out. If you're following this story so far, do the algorithm a small favor and drop a like. It helps the channel stay independent enough to keep digging through declassified Pentagon paperwork for stories like this one. 6 of the 8 crew members ejected or climbed out through the top hatch and pulled their chutes. 5 of them survived. 3 of them did not. Major Shelton, Major Richards, and Sergeant Barnish were killed either in the crash itself or in the failed escape from the disintegrating airframe. Below them, a crippled 200,000-pound bomber began its final fall over Wayne County, North Carolina. Most of it slammed into a soybean and tobacco field near the town of Faro, and bolted into the belly of that airplane. Waiting for the impact were the 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what a Mark 39 hydrogen bomb actually is and how it was engineered to arm itself. The Mark 39 was a 2-stage thermonuclear weapon, standard American strategic issue in the late 1950s and early 60s. It weighed just over 3 tons. From nose to tail it measured almost 12 feet. It was designed to be released from a bomber flying at high altitude and to detonate at low altitude, above the surface of its target, where the airburst would flatten the largest possible area. To achieve that, the bomb followed a precise, mechanical sequence during its fall. Nothing in it was digital. Nothing in it was electronic in the modern sense. It was a chain of switches, timers, and mechanical safeties, all designed to close in exactly the right order, and all designed to stay open if the drop was accidental. Here is how the sequence was supposed to work. The moment the bomb left the aircraft's bomb bay, a wire pulled taut and started an internal timer. That timer ran for 42 seconds. Around 8 seconds into the fall, a small parachute deployed to slow the descent, giving the bomber time to fly clear before detonation. Roughly halfway through the fall, the timer expired, and it closed a switch that sent a signal down to the bomb's arming section. The arming section then routed that signal through a series of additional safety switches. The last of those safety switches was a small, low-voltage electromechanical device. As long as it stayed in the safe position, no detonation signal could reach the primary. If it flipped to the armed position, the bomb was live. At the very end, when the nose of the falling bomb finally hit the ground, a crush mechanism inside the tip closed the final firing circuit. Detonation. That was the design. Here is what happened over Faro, North Carolina, at just after midnight. When Keep 19 tore itself apart at around 10,000 feet, both Mark 39 bombs came loose from the bomb bay. From the perspective of each bomb's internal mechanism, this looked identical to a deliberate release. The lanyards yanked. The timer started. The sequence began. The first bomb behaved almost exactly as if it had been dropped on purpose. Its parachute deployed. Its 42-second timer ran cleanly to completion. The arming signal was sent. The signal traveled through the safety chain. When the bomb finally hit the ground, its nose-crush mechanism fired. Every step of the firing sequence was completed, except for one. The final safety switch, that small, low-voltage device, had happened to be in the safe position when the bomb left the aircraft. And it had happened to stay in the safe position for the entire fall. That was the only reason the electrical current stopped there, instead of continuing on to the primary. That was the only reason the bomb did not detonate. A recovery team found it hanging by its deployed parachute from a tree, upright, nose down, in a field near Faro. It was, in the words of one of the engineers later dispatched by Sandia National Laboratories to inspect it, essentially a fully armed thermonuclear weapon that had done everything it was designed to do except go off. The second bomb had a different and darker fate. Its parachute never opened. Instead of drifting down over the field, it fell almost vertically at close to 700 miles per hour, punched through the topsoil of a wet farm field, and drove itself, secondary first, into the ground. By the time the impact energy had spent itself, the bomb had buried itself roughly 180 feet down. A recovery operation began within days. Army engineers dug and pumped and shored and eventually retrieved the bomb's arming section, its plutonium primary, and much of its casing. What they never retrieved, what remained 180 feet below the topsoil of a farm field in North Carolina, and what remains there today, was the uranium secondary, the thermonuclear core. That is the object under the field. In the days after Faro, the United States Air Force sent an inspection team to comb the crash site, catalog every recovered component, and quietly walk the story back for the public. Locally, a press release described the incident as the accidental loss of a training weapon. Regionally, newspapers ran short items about a crash bomber with an unspecified payload. Nationally, almost no one heard anything at all. Officially, the position of the American government for decades was straightforward. There had been an aircraft accident. There had been an accidental release of weapons. But at no point the Air Force insisted had the American public been in any real danger. The bombs, they said, could not have detonated. Not under any circumstances. That was the story from 1961 until, essentially, the 21st century. Then the documents began to leak. Some of them came out through the 1994 release of a Sandia National Laboratories internal review. Others came out through Freedom of Information Act filings pursued by researchers and journalists across the 2000s. The single most damaging one, however, was a 1969 internal memorandum written by a Sandia engineer named Parker F. Jones. Jones had spent his career on the nuclear safety of American weapons, the specific question of how and why they were supposed to never accidentally go off. He had studied the Faro incident in forensic detail. His conclusion, when it was finally declassified in 2013 and picked up by Eric Schlosser and The Guardian, was almost surgically brief. According to Jones's own written summary of the 4 safety mechanisms designed into the Mark 39, 3 had already been defeated by the fall. A 4th mechanism, he wrote, was known to be unreliable and had, in similar B-52 accidents, failed in ways that could have completed the arming sequence. The reason the Faro bomb had not detonated was, in his words, essentially one low-voltage, dynamotor-driven arming switch that had happened to remain in the safe position throughout the fall. Jones ended the memo with a single sentence that has since become one of the most quoted lines in the history of American nuclear safety. It read, in essence, that one simple low-voltage switch had stood between the United States and a major catastrophe. That is, in the technical language of a career weapons safety engineer, an admission. And it is a very different story from the one that had been told to the American public for 3 decades. Because the catastrophe that switch stood between was not abstract. If the bomb had detonated at the altitude it was hanging from, nose down in a tree, roughly ground level over eastern North Carolina, the effects would have followed a well-modeled pattern. The immediate blast and thermal radiation would have flattened and burned much of Wayne County. Fires would have spread outward through fields, farms, and the town of Goldsboro itself. Everyone within roughly 8.5 miles of ground zero would have been dead within seconds. But the 4-megaton airburst was not the real long-term threat. The real long-term threat was the fallout. Prevailing winds at that time of year over eastern North Carolina push northeast. According to a modeling estimate first published jointly by The Guardian and the Arms Control Association, a 4-megaton ground-level detonation at Faro would have deposited lethal dose radioactive fallout in a corridor extending over Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, and as far north as New York City. Millions of people in the population centers of the American Northeast would have received a lethal dose of radiation within hours or days. Cancer rates in the affected corridor would have surged for decades. The rate of children born with severe genetic damage would have spiked. Farmland from Virginia through New Jersey would have been effectively uninhabitable for a human generation. And this would have happened not because a Soviet weapon had reached the eastern seaboard, but because an American weapon had fallen off an American airplane over an American field, and because the last of 4 safety mechanisms had held. Sit with that for a second. 3 out of 4 safety systems failed on their own. 1 held by mechanical accident. That is the entire margin. It is, in the words of the same Sandia review, the closest the United States has ever come to nuclear detonating a piece of its own territory. Here is the part of the story most people never hear. Faro was not a freak accident. Faro was one entry on a very long list. The formal name inside the Pentagon for an incident involving an American nuclear weapon that fell outside expected parameters, released, lost, damaged, jettisoned, or accidentally detonated in its non-nuclear components, was and is a broken arrow. When researchers went back through the declassified records that came out between the 1990s and 2021, they were able to count at the very least 32 officially acknowledged broken arrow events involving American weapons. Independent estimates, based on partial documents and Freedom of Information Act filings, put the true figure much higher. The full list is almost certainly still classified. Some of them are, individually, worth their own documentary. There was the March 1958 incident over Mars Bluff, South Carolina, in which a Mark VI atomic bomb accidentally released from a B-47 and hit the yard of a rural home. The high explosive trigger detonated. It did not produce a nuclear yield, but it wounded 6 members of the same family and left a crater in the ground that is still visible today from the air. There was the January 1968 incident over Thule Air Base, Greenland, in which a B-52 carrying 4 thermonuclear weapons caught fire in flight and crashed into the sea ice. The conventional explosives in all 4 bombs detonated. Plutonium spread across the ice. Cleanup crews spent months scraping contaminated snow into containers. One of the bombs, depending on which source you trust, was never fully recovered. There was the 1958 loss of a Mark 15 thermonuclear bomb off Tybee Island, Georgia, after a mid-air collision. To this day, the bomb has never been found. There are hobbyist divers who still search for it. And there was the January 1961 incident, only 3 weeks before Faro, when a B-52 on a Chrome Dome route crashed near Yuba City, California, with 2 nuclear weapons on board. The weapons remained intact only because they had been carried with certain safeties left engaged that would normally have been removed on approach. Once you start reading, they begin to blur together. Different states, different years, different aircraft, same shape of story. The pattern is not a series of 1 in a million flukes. The pattern is a program. Between 1960 and 1968, the United States flew live nuclear weapons over its own citizens on a permanent, rotating schedule. Some of those weapons fell. Some of those weapons burned. Some of those weapons buried themselves in American ground. And in almost every case, the reason a mushroom cloud did not appear over an American town came down to one thing: the last safety. If you are the kind of person who wants to understand how these systems keep repeating themselves, the same trade-offs, the same near misses, the same public silence, subscribe. This channel is a permanent seat at the archive. Operation Chrome Dome was formally terminated on January 22, 1968, after the Thule crash. The Pentagon quietly accepted that a program which flew live nuclear weapons over populated areas on a permanent basis was going to produce, statistically, exactly the kind of accidents it kept producing. But the story does not end there, because ending airborne alert did not end the problem. It simply moved the problem into the ground. And 19 years after Faro, deep inside a hardened concrete missile silo in central Arkansas, a young Air Force mechanic dropped a socket from a wrench. An 8-pound piece of steel fell roughly 70 feet down the inside of the silo, bounced off the base of a launch platform, and punched a hole in the pressurized first-stage fuel tank of a fully armed Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile. Bolted to the tip of that missile was a 9-megaton thermonuclear warhead, more than twice the yield of one of the Faro bombs. The date was September 18, 1980. The place was Damascus, Arkansas, and the United States was about to almost do it again. To understand what happened next in Damascus, Arkansas, you have to understand what a Titan II was. The Titan II was, at the time of the accident, the single most powerful weapon in the American nuclear arsenal. It was a liquid-fueled intercontinental ballistic missile, about 100 feet tall, roughly 10 feet in diameter, and weighed close to 330,000 pounds fully fueled. It carried a single W-53 thermonuclear warhead with a yield of 9 megatons, 9 million tons of TNT, more than 500 times the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. 54 of these missiles sat inside hardened underground silos across 3 American states, Arkansas, Kansas, and Arizona, on constant alert throughout the late 1960s and the 1970s. They were maintained by Air Force crews who worked in shifts sealed inside concrete and steel launch complexes, waiting for a phone call from a North American Aerospace Defense Command that, in practice, everyone hoped would never come. Launch Complex 374-7 sat in a wheat field outside the small town of Damascus in Van Buren County, Arkansas. On the evening of September 18, 1980, a 2-man Air Force maintenance crew descended into the silo to perform what should have been a routine job, a pressure adjustment on the missile's oxidizer tank. One of the airmen was using a ratchet wrench with a large socket attached to the end of it. At approximately 6:30 in the evening, the socket came loose from the wrench. It was a piece of hardened steel that weighed roughly 8 pounds. It fell from a platform about 70 feet above the base of the silo. On the way down, it bounced off a thrust mount, changed direction, and struck the outer skin of the missile's first-stage fuel tank. It punched a hole clean through it. Aerozine 50, the highly volatile, highly toxic liquid fuel that powered the Titan II, began venting into the sealed silo. Because the fuel was hypergolic, meaning it ignited spontaneously on contact with the missile's separate oxidizer, and because the concentration of vapor in the silo was rising by the second, the launch complex was now, in effect, a slow-fuse bomb wrapped around a thermonuclear warhead. Air Force Command was notified within minutes. The 2 airmen in the silo were pulled out. Emergency protocols were activated. Fuel vapor levels inside the silo were monitored remotely from a control bunker. Local law enforcement was contacted. A perimeter was set up, but the vapor kept rising. For the next roughly 8.5 hours, the situation stayed inside a narrow, thin band of manageable, bad, but not yet catastrophic. Then, sometime after 3 in the morning on September 19th, 2 young airmen were sent back down into the silo complex in protective suits to take one more set of readings. They did not make it back out on their own. At approximately 3 in the morning local time, the accumulated fuel vapor inside the silo detonated. The blast lifted the 740-ton concrete silo door, a piece of reinforced concrete and steel roughly the size of a small building, off its hinges, tossed it several hundred feet through the air, and dropped it in a nearby field. It ripped the missile itself apart from the inside. It sent a fireball hundreds of feet into the Arkansas night. It killed one of the 2 airmen in the silo, 21-year-old David Livingston, and injured 21 others, including several sheriff's deputies and Air Force personnel outside the perimeter. And it did something else. The explosion ejected the missile's 9-megaton W-53 warhead, the thermonuclear payload, still fully assembled, up out of the destroyed silo, through the open door, and across the surrounding wheat field. The warhead came to rest, according to declassified Air Force reports, roughly 100 to 200 yards from a launch complex. It did not detonate. It did not crack. It did not release its nuclear material. For the second time in 19 years, a fully armed American thermonuclear weapon had come loose from its intended platform, endured an event that was never supposed to happen to it, and simply, quietly, refused to complete its firing sequence. Recovery crews reached the warhead within hours of dawn. It was wet, dented, muddy, and to the men who first approached it, terrifying to touch. It was also mechanically exactly what it had been the day before it was ejected, an intact 9-megaton thermonuclear device, complete with its arming assemblies, physics package, and firing system. Air Force teams secured it, transported it out, and eventually returned it to the American nuclear stockpile for inspection and later dismantlement. Unlike the secondary at Faro, the Damascus warhead was fully recovered. The public affairs response was, in the beginning, almost identical to 1961. There had been an accident. There was no danger. There was no risk of a nuclear detonation. The public should not be concerned. That story lasted longer in Arkansas than in North Carolina, partly because the initial official statements were made by both the Air Force and by a young state governor named Bill Clinton, who at the time was campaigning for re-election and did not want a nuclear accident to become the story of his final months in office. Clinton and his lieutenant governor were both briefed on the presence of the warhead in the field before it became public knowledge, and both, for political reasons, initially declined to say so out loud. The full story of the Damascus accident, including how close the warhead had come to being triggered, how badly the surrounding communities had been exposed to toxic propellant vapor, and how much luck had been involved in the fact that only one man was killed, did not become widely understood by the American public until Eric Schlosser published his book Command and Control in 2013. That book, drawing on more than 3 decades of subsequent declassifications and interviews with the surviving airmen, is the reason most people who know about Damascus at all know about it. What Schlosser and other researchers established in the course of that reporting was that the physical margin between the Damascus explosion and a 9-megaton nuclear detonation had not been comfortable. It had once again come down to specific engineering choices about how a warhead is supposed to behave when the missile carrying it is destroyed underneath it. The W-53, like the Mark 39, was designed with multiple layers of mechanical and electrical safeties intended to keep it from arming during an accidental release. During the Damascus explosion, according to later Air Force and Sandia analysis, some of those layers were exposed to conditions well outside their design envelope. Extreme heat, extreme shock, the mechanical trauma of being blown out of a hardened silo, and had held for reasons that engineers had to reconstruct after the fact. The pattern is the same as at Faro. The safeties are designed to be redundant. Then something happens that no one modeled. Then most of the redundancy fails. Then one component, for reasons that are partly design and partly luck, does not. The scale of what almost happened at Damascus is worth pausing on. A 9-megaton airburst over central Arkansas would have vaporized everything within roughly 10 miles of the silo. The blast wave would have destroyed structures well past the outskirts of Little Rock. And the fallout plume, given typical late September weather patterns over the American South, would have drifted east and northeast across the population centers of the Mississippi Delta, potentially reaching Memphis, Nashville, and the industrial heart of the Ohio Valley within 24 hours. Millions of people. Again, and this is the part that should probably be sitting a little heavier than it does in most conversations about the Cold War. Between Faro in 1961 and Damascus in 1980, a span of 19 years, the United States twice came within, essentially, the margin of a single mechanical component of nuclear detonating a piece of its own territory. In both cases, the weapon involved was many times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. In both cases, the population downwind was in the millions. In both cases, the government's initial public position was that no danger had existed. In both cases, the record eventually said otherwise. But it took decades. You can, if you want, find the exact wording. It is in the Sandia memos. It is in the declassified Air Force reports. It is in Schlosser's book. It is in the Guardian's 2013 coverage of the Jones Memorandum. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is, at this point, simply history. Which brings us back to 2 pieces of ground. Faro, North Carolina, still exists. The field still exists. The uranium secondary from the second Mark 39 bomb is still, according to the United States government's own filings, resting roughly 180 feet below the topsoil, encased in whatever remains of its casing. The United States Army Corps of Engineers holds a permanent restrictive easement over the ground above it. That easement forbids any digging, drilling, well boring, or excavation to a specified depth in perpetuity. The land above is farmed, harvested, replanted, and farmed again. Below a certain depth, it is not, and will not be, disturbed. There is a granite marker on the shoulder of the road. It reads, in essentially standard state highway marker language, that a nuclear weapon incident occurred here on January 24, 1961. It does not use the word broken arrow. It does not include the word switch. It does not say what is under the soil. Someone driving past at highway speed would probably not even notice it. Damascus, Arkansas still exists too. Launch Complex 374-7 does not. The silo was destroyed in the explosion, sealed and buried. The land was eventually sold. There is a small privately maintained memorial nearby. There is also a small crater in the earth where the 740-ton silo door came back down in 1980 and stayed until it was carted off. 2 pieces of American ground, one with a granite marker, one with a crater, both still there, both quiet, both in their own way still ours. There is a temptation, when telling a story like this, to end on the reassuring version of the moral. To say that the reason both of these events ended the way they ended was engineering. That somewhere in the 1950s, in a quiet office at Sandia, an engineer sat down and asked what would happen if everything went wrong, and designed for it, and that is why we are all still here. That version of the moral is not wrong. Parker Jones was right about the switch. The engineers who designed the W-53's arming logic were right about how it was supposed to behave under blast. The redundancy did, in the technical sense, work, but the redundancy worked with almost none of its margins to spare. At Faro, 3 of 4 safety systems failed. At Damascus, several of the warhead's expected safety envelopes were exceeded. In both cases, the difference between the historical record we actually have and a historical record in which several American cities no longer exist came down to a single component behaving, mechanically, the way it was supposed to behave, at a moment when nothing else was. That is not the same thing as saying we were safe. It is the same thing as saying we got lucky, and that the luck was partially earned. There is another version of the ending, though, and it is worth sitting with. Between 1960 and 1968, the American military flew live thermonuclear weapons over its own population around the clock. Between the 1960s and the 1980s, the American military kept live thermonuclear warheads seated on top of liquid-fueled missiles buried in the ground of Arkansas and Kansas and Arizona. In both eras, when things went wrong, and things went wrong dozens of times, the accidents did not become nuclear detonations. And in almost every case, the reason was documented decades later in an internal memo that most Americans have still never heard of. The people who lived downwind of those weapons, the farmers of Wayne County, the families of Van Buren County, the residents of the American Southeast and the American South, mostly never knew, at the time, how close they had come. Many of them still do not know. That more than the switch is the part of this story that has never fully been resolved. So, 2 questions to leave you with, and I mean these as real questions, not rhetorical ones. First, given that the historical record shows the Cold War came within, essentially, one safety switch of a domestic nuclear detonation on at least 2 separate occasions, do you think the doctrine of permanent airborne alert and hair-trigger ground alert was, in retrospect, an acceptable risk, or a mistake we survived by accident? Drop your answer in the comments. Second, if you were downwind of one of those 2 fields, would you want to know? If this kind of long-form investigation is what you're here for, hit like, subscribe, and stay for the next one. There are a lot more broken arrows on that list, and most of them have never been told properly on this platform. See you in the next episode.